Thank you for tuning in to the Ultimate Coach podcast, a companion to the transformative book, The Ultimate Coach, written by Amy Hardison and Alan D. Thompson. Each conversation is designed to be a powerful wake-up call, reminding us of what's possible for you and your life. So if you're on a journey to expand your state of being, this podcast is for you. Thank you for joining me for the Ultimate Coach podcast. This is a very special episode because it is number 100, and I have the perfect guest to celebrate this very special occasion, Eric Lofholm. Eric, welcome to the show.
Meredith, I'm excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to share with the community.
Well, as we were thinking about this, EPEC Williamson, of course, is a co-host and lead for the podcast. And as we were talking about who would be the perfect guest for this, we both agreed it must be Eric, because you're the one who got this whole thing started when the book first was published towards the end of 2021. And you set up the Ultimate Coach Facebook group. And wow, has this being movement exploded ever since then. And so I'm excited about talking with you about the evolution that's happened over these past 3 years. And I thought it would be fun because we have so many folks that have joined the group, in, say, the past year, for you to share a little bit about the origin story. What was it that caused you to make this commitment and get this group set up?
Yeah, I think that stories is a really great way to communicate. And I never had on my goals list to lead the being movement or start a Facebook group and all the things that have occurred. It just organically happened. And it goes back to around 2010. I had a coach named Gary Henson. And Gary said, you really need to check out Steve Hardison's content. He has the best content out there. And I'm somebody who loves knowledge. And when somebody says that this person's content's the best, I have to know, who is this person? Because I wasn't familiar with Steve at that time. And the only piece of content that I could find on Steve was the TBO LINFL video that's up on YouTube. And I just loved that piece of content. And that led me to ultimately become Facebook friends with Steve. And many people have a connection with Steve through Facebook. And so we just would start communicating over Messenger from time to time. And I ended up being in Phoenix on business. And I asked Steve if we could get together for coffee because I wanted to meet, the great Steve Hardison. And he said, well, I don't want to do coffee, but if you'd like to come over to the house, you're welcome to come to the home. And so I was like, great. And so I ended up having a BWA session with Steve. Now he charges $10,000 for that 2-hour session. But back then he didn't charge. And I didn't even know what a BWA session was. I just wanted to meet Steve. And so I went over to the house. And the next thing you know, I'm in his office and we're doing this intensive coaching session. And I found out about his coaching fees at that time. And I was not prepared to make that kind of an investment. So I didn't hire Steve to coach me. That was back around 2013. And we stayed in touch over Facebook Messenger. And then when his book was being written, The Ultimate Coach, there was a number of people that were included in on getting advanced copies of the book and making contributions to the book. And Alan Thompson, who did the research on the book, reached out to me and asked me if I had any communication with Steve in written format, email, Facebook Messenger, etc. And so I had this history of these Facebook Messenger communications, which I sent to Alan. And I didn't think anything of it, Meredith. I just thought, he's asking for this, fine, here it is. That nothing registered that this was a significant thing. Well, it turned out that some of that communication made it into the book. And so when the book came out and I got my copy and I'm reading it and I see my name in the book, and I was just like a kid at Christmas getting presents. I just thought that was the neatest thing, that I was in the book. And it's not like there's a chapter on me. It's just like a tiny mention. And so I reached out to Steve and I said, hey, thanks for including me in the book. It, really meant a lot to me. And it did mean a lot to me. I was being sincere because of who Steve Hardison is to me. It was really significant. And so he said, call me tomorrow. So I said, all right. So I called him the next day and he's sharing with me his enthusiasm for the book. And it was screaming at me, Meredith, that Steve needed a Facebook group because of who Steve is and the book. And I just knew in that moment there was going to be people from all over the world that were going to want to gather, and Facebook group was the way that I thought would be the best way to do it. And so I said, you need a Facebook group, Steve. And he said, well, I don't know anything about that. And I'm on Facebook, but I don't know about Facebook groups. And I go, I know a lot about it. So if you want, I will set it up, lead it, manage it, run it, turnkey. You don't have to lift a finger. I'll just do it for you. And by the end of the call, we agreed that we would do it. And so later on that night, I got the group all set up. I added him and I was ready to publish it to the world. And I checked in with him one more time. Are you sure, Steve? Because I'm about to put this out to the world. And he said, yep, let's do it. And so the group started growing at about 1,000 people a week for the first several weeks. And now we're, almost 3 years in, we're at a little over 10,000 members in the group. And I agreed to do this out of my love for Steve. I wasn't doing it for the community, although we have the community and I love serving the community. It was literally my relationship with Steve. Here's a way that I could give something to the ultimate coach, a human being who has everything that money can buy. You couldn't buy him anything that he needs because he has everything he needs, but I could give him a Facebook group. So I gave him the Facebook group. And shortly thereafter, he reached out to me and he's like, hey, I love what you're doing on Facebook. Can you do it on Instagram? And so I said, sure. And I don't really, to this day, know much about Instagram, but I know how to delegate and I know how to lead. And so I went and found some people to lead the Instagram. And then it was, can you do it on LinkedIn? Can you do it on YouTube? Hey, Steve, do you want a podcast? And so now we have TikTok and Twitter. And so we've got all these different social media platforms and it just kept growing. And now we're serving the community in all these different ways. And so this went on for, I don't know, another year. And one significant thing that happened early on with the Facebook group is I made a 20-year commitment to leading the Facebook group. And Steve never paid me for it. I never asked him for any compensation. I was happy to do it out of my love for Steve. And so that commitment created the Instagram and the LinkedIn and the YouTube and the podcast and so forth. And so then that commitment created Steve coming to me and saying, Amy, my wife, Amy and I talked, and we want somebody to create a company. There's all this energy around the book and the Facebook group and so forth and all the social media channels, and you're the person to do it. Do you want it? And I, at that point, full-time running my sales training company, father of 4, husband, leading a very full life. I agreed to take it on. And so I took on, so now I have 2 companies, Being Movement International and my sales training company. So now we have even more ways that we're serving our community. And so that's the origin story of what got us to this point.
Oh, it's so amazing when you step out in faith because you didn't know what was going to happen. You couldn't have foreseen all the different ways this movement would grow and actually explode so powerfully. And I want to talk some about all the different offerings or options that people have choices about because there are so many. One of the ones that I know has been very powerful are the live events. And talk a little bit about that very first one, because the idea of how that one came to be is just, to me, a representation of how different people felt called, like you did, to get involved and step out and just say, I'll do this. and see what happens.
Yeah, you make a great point about people feeling called to serve. And it goes back to Alan Thompson enrolling Steve into writing the book in the first place. It was Alan's idea and his persistence, and Steve was not interested in a book being brought into the world. And Alan was just so persistent and so persuasive, and Steve said, okay, we'll do it. And then Alan did the research, and then the book went over to Amy, and Amy felt called to write the book based on Alan's research. And so she did that out of a serving the community. And all these people have been called now, and they've answered the call. And Judy Thurston is the one who created the Ultimate Experience, the first live event that we did. She created, her and her team, in Arizona several years ago. And that just happened very organically. I was there with my family. There was, I don't know, 150, 200, 300 people. I'm not sure exactly, but it was hundreds of people. And then that turned into the Ultimate Experience in the UK, and Matt Smith birthed that. And then Ron John did it over in India. These are all people that felt called to put on these events. And as far as I know, they had never put on large events before. And then Matt Evans and Fiona put the one on in Birmingham, which happened earlier this year. And Gabby Puma is now doing one in Peru. And then Judy did another one in Arizona. And then Judy has another one scheduled. So these are, for any of you, all of you listening, if you get an opportunity to attend one of the live Ultimate Experience events, they're incredible. I've been to 2 of them. So that's one way that we serve the community. And there's so many different ways, and it's all out of, Meredith, just people feeling called to serve. And so another way is our book readings. And so Tanya Alvarez leads our book readings, and we've done it read from start to the finish of the book. And I think they're like 90-minute Zoom sessions, and there's about 30 minutes of reading, and then they have a discussion around it. And so people from all over the world gather on these book readings, and it creates all these miracles, and it's totally free. And so we've got the book readings. We have, right now, we just started going live in the Facebook group, doing a 15-minute being Facebook Live at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. I think it's 8 o'clock UK time. Every day, one of our leaders is going live inside of the Facebook group. Why don't you talk about the podcast, since we have 2 people that oversee the podcast. You and EPEC do the interviews. Tell us a little bit about the podcast.
You know, it's so funny. I would say I felt a nudge more than a calling. It was just during my quiet time. And this has been over 2 years ago now, because I've been doing this since, it was August 2 years ago. And I was just in my quiet time, and it hit me, Meredith, offer to help with the podcast. And I thought, well, is that... Then I just sat on it for a couple of days, and then Steve happened to call me. Right? And I mentioned it to him. I said, oh, it's so interesting that you call. I was just thinking about, because I've had my own podcast since 2019. And so I thought, I've got these skills as a podcaster. And he had listened to some of my episodes. And so I said, Steve, I was thinking about offering to be one of the hosts on the podcast. I'll never forget his answer. He said, yes. And I'm going to call Eric right now and tell him. Then he called me back within a minute and said, I forgot, Eric likes to delegate. And so he ended up calling the person who at that time was in charge of the podcast to say, get Meredith on board as one of the hosts. And so it was just one of those, things that I felt led to do, and I have just loved it. And then, of course, different folks have come and gone, as happens with different commitments for various reasons. And so EPEC came on board a little over a year ago, and she and I have just been like a well-oiled machine. We've got the podcast episodes scheduled, a couple of months in advance. And so it's just working out so beautifully. We've invited people who, are active in the being community or in some aspect being of service, and have them come in and have conversations with us about the specific aspects of the book or being that have been most impactful for them. And so of course, people that are listening to this are already familiar with the podcast. I encourage them to share with others, because these conversations can be life-changing. There can be just one nugget that someone shares that just hits a listener in a particular way and radically changes how they see the world or how they see themselves or their relationships. And so to me, the podcast has just been one more beautiful aspect of what's been created and co-created with this movement.
Yeah, and now we're up to 100 episodes and counting, and it comes out like clockwork. I think we're in a twice a month frequency, and so for all of you listening, you can introduce the podcast to somebody who's not familiar with the Being Movement, and then they can listen. If they like it, shoot, there's 100 episodes right there of content. And one of the things that I'm really proud of, as I mentioned in the origin story, back in 2010, the only piece of content that I could find online of Steve's was the TBOLINFL YouTube video. And if you guys haven't watched that one, you definitely want to check that one out. We now have hundreds of pieces of content that are available totally free online. And it's a way where all of you listening, you can share this with your friends and family, and it doesn't require that they make, hundreds of dollars of an investment or thousands of dollars of an investment. It's free. And the way to get somebody connected to our community, our main website is beingmovement.com. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, it has all of our social media channels. So we serve with regular posts on Instagram. We have our Facebook group, our YouTube channel. I always say there's over $100,000 in free being content on that YouTube channel. There's hundreds of videos, including hour-long videos of Steve Hardison. Steve charges $4,000 to $5,000 an hour for coaching, depending on what package you select. And you can go do hour-long sessions with Steve right on the YouTube channel, and it's totally free. And you can share that with your friends and family. We're on TikTok now. We're on X. We've got the book readings. We've got the live events. Something else that I started with recently, Meredith, is a virtual seminar. It's a 2-day course over Zoom, and it's called Being Transformation, and it's free. So people can go to beingmovement.com if they want to come and have a 2-day experience with me, with their friends and family, learn all about being. There's so many free options. We do have some paid options, and they're all very affordable, but the number of free options we have is just absolutely incredible.
Hey, I would love for you to talk some more about the Transformation 2-day event, because that is virtual, right? And so people are able to register for that from beingmovement.com.
Yeah, the thing about it, I've done, I think, around 20 days of transformational work. And what I mean by transformational work is, 2, 3, 4-day seminars. I've done a number of the courses through Landmark. I used to work for Tony Robbins, and when I worked for him, I did a number of his courses, the Firewalk and Date with Destiny, which is featured on that Netflix show, I'm Not Your Guru, if any of you have seen that. So I did Date with Destiny. I did a course called Money and You, which is based on Buckminster Fuller's principles. And so I love transformational training. And I started teaching myself in 1999. So I started my sales training company, and I would do half-day seminars, full day, some cases 2-day seminars. And so I've been teaching for 25 years. And then when I got involved with the Being Movement, and I started learning about being, I'm like, oh, I want to do seminars on this. And so I taught one earlier this year, and then I have another one coming up here in the very near future. And then we're going to be doing another one in early January. And so instead of charging, hundreds of dollars, it's free. And people can come and have a transformational experience, and they can take a look at who they're being in a variety of areas of their life and make some new decisions about how they want to show up. And so my idea behind it is you come to the seminar on day one, a certain person, and at the end of day two, you're a different person. And then when you come and you have this amazing experience, we teach it once a quarter is the frequency that I'm going to do. And so the next one we do, invite all your friends and family, because now you'll know how great it is. And I want to get 1,000 people a quarter doing this free event. And that will be one of the ways that I want to expand the movement, because my vision is to reach all of humanity. I want all of humanity to have access to this information. And the other day, a gentleman was reaching out to me. He was selling me a translation service. And there's this new product out there, Meredith. There's probably more than one. But what it does is it takes video content and it uses AI and it turns it into multiple languages. So that's one of the things. If we're going to reach all of humanity, we need Chinese and French and Spanish and all kinds of languages I don't even know about, right? So the technology now exists to take video content and put it into languages where people can understand. And I do believe it's possible, even though that's a huge number, all of humanity. But with the movement and our social media channels and the fact that the foundation of the movement is free. I mean, we do obviously encourage you to buy the book, The Ultimate Coach, which is a $20 book. But outside of that purchase, it doesn't require any additional purchases of coaching, although we have that and other services. We have paid services, but the core movement itself doesn't require financial investment. And I believe because of that, this can go viral.
That's great. I love that. Well, as you were just talking, I was thinking about your own transformations since getting involved in the being movement and focusing on what being has meant for you. Tell us about your own evolution. Are there certain areas that you can say, wow, I really have transformed how I am being in this particular area?
Yeah. The thing about being is it impacts our whole life. So when you're able to, wrap your arms around what is this thing called being. So a couple of the being principles. So 3 distinctions of being is we're always being. So the movement itself doesn't teach anybody how to be. Everybody's always being anyway. So we're always being. Number 2 is we can observe our being. So once you understand that you're always being, we can at any time take a look. I had this conversation with my wife last night. It didn't go so good. Who was I being? I was being, I'm right, you're wrong. I was being, you're not listening to me. And so when we're being that, it creates a certain way. And then the third distinction of being is we can shift our being. So we're always being, we can observe our being, we can shift our being. That's what I want to teach to all of humanity, because once you have that, it creates incredible miracle possibilities. So prior to the book, I had never heard of being as a distinction. I've been studying the mind since 1988, and that started with Louise Hay's book, You Can Heal Your Life, and I had my time with Tony Robbins and Landmark and so forth. So I love knowledge like so many of our community does, but I had never heard of being as a distinction. And so leading the Facebook group and now the Being Movement International company, I'm in the being conversation all day, every day. And so I've had an opportunity to take a look at, for example, family relationships, whether it's my wife, my kids, my mom, my dad. And so I'd have a communication, and sometimes that communication would go haywire because I would get triggered, I'd be angry, or I'd be frustrated, and I would be communicating from that place. And I didn't have the distinction that I could observe my being. So if I'm being angry, I'm just like, oh, well, I'm angry. That's just the way it is. Versus let's make a distinction between I'm angry versus I'm being angry. Being implies choice. So I had this negative interaction with my dad. I'm angry, right? But once I learned, no, I'm being angry. Instead of being angry, I could be loving. So I had this conversation with Steve Hardison one time when I hired him to coach me. And so I'm in his office and we're talking about my relationship with my dad. And I said, so Steve, what do you want me to do? Just be loving with my dad? And I had this whole story about all these hoops that my dad had to jump through to restore our relationship. And he goes, yeah. It's like, wait, what? You want me just to be loving? Just be that? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, wow, that is so simple. And I had all these steps that had to take place. Well, my dad had to do this, and he had to apologize for this, and he had to own this. And then Steve's like, no, just be loving. And that had never even occurred to me. So when we have a grudge with somebody, there might be somebody listening to our podcast right now, and they haven't talked to their sister in 5 years. And so their sister did something to them, or they did something to the sister, and they stopped talking, and they haven't talked in 5 years. And they're in this, like, we just don't talk. We don't talk to each other. And maybe they could be listening to this right now and go, wow, I could just reach out to my sister today, haven't talked to her in 5 years, and just say, hey, sis, I just want to let you know I love you, I miss you, and I just want to hear your voice. And then this miracle opens up. It's simple, right? So I'll just tell one story that really drives home the point of how transformational this has been for me and why I love sharing about being with others, because all the personal development work that I had done, I'd never learned about being. So my daughter, who's a sophomore in college now, and her senior year, she's getting ready to start her senior year of high school, and she was living with me at the time. I'm divorced. I'm remarried now, but with my first wife, we divorced, and my first wife lives in the same community that I do. And so my daughter was due home right before senior year was supposed to start. And I texted her and I said, what time are you going to be home? And she said, I'm staying at mom's tonight. And that wasn't really unusual because her mom lives in the community and no problem. My daughter has a car. So then the next day I text her, what time are you coming home? And she goes, I'm staying with mom again tonight. I was like, oh, okay. Really that was normal. Then the next night school starts and I said, what time where are you coming home? She goes, I live with mom now. And Meredith, in my mind, I went ballistic. I was angry, hurt, sad, disappointed. And my mind immediately went to being manipulative. Now, I didn't say this to my daughter, but where my brain went was to say to her, oh, I thought you wanted me to pay for your college. I guess you don't want me to pay for your college anymore. If you want me to pay for your college, you didn't get home, right? I didn't say that, but that's where my thinking was. And so we didn't talk for a few days. And for a few days, I was in angry and frustration. And so I walked into a Starbucks being angry about the situation. And I did what Steve teaches. And I just stopped in Starbucks for a second in my thinking. And I said, who am I being right now? I'm being hurt, angry, sad, disappointed. Okay. So Eric, you can shift your being. Who do you want to be, or who do you need to be for your daughter right now? I need to be unconditional love. So in that moment, in the Starbucks, I sent her a text and I said, hey, I'm a Starbucks. You want a Starbucks? And she's like, yeah, I want a Starbucks. When I was walking into that Starbucks, Meredith, she was not getting a Starbucks. And so I took her to Starbucks and I just stopped being angry and I just started being loving. And eventually she moved back home, but that doesn't even matter. What the point of the story is that we have the ability to go from being angry to being loving, and we can literally just shift it. And so I now have that power because I understand enough about being to do that. And that's what I'm excited to share with the world. And for all of you listening, this content around being can transform, your entire life. And in order to do it, I always talk about lifting the weights, right? If you want to improve your body, you got to lift the weights. Well, if you want to improve your being, you got to lift the weights and you got to do the work. And so that's where the podcast comes in. If you go and listen to the podcast episodes, that's like lifting the being weights. If you go to the YouTube channel, if you do the book reading, if you come to the 2-day being transformation, if you come to the ultimate experience event, and all these other things that we have, all of that is you working on your being, and your mind's going to be making these distinctions.
Yeah.
And it's going to help you.
That's such a powerful example. And what's interesting, Eric, is we don't have to take days, weeks, months, or even hours. You shifted instantly.
Yeah.
In that. And I think it goes back to that second distinction you were talking about, is observing ourselves, raising that awareness to where we can see how we are being in a given moment and realizing we have a choice. It's so empowering to be able to do that. I would love for you to share, because you've spoken with and interacted with so many people in this community. What are a few other examples of transformations you've seen people have within themselves, with their relationships, with their work? Doesn't matter, but I would love for you to share some examples that stand out for you.
Yeah. One that comes to mind is Lindsay and Casey Gilman. And they were amongst the first people to join the Facebook group. And at the time, Casey was not on Facebook. Not everybody's on Facebook. And Lindsay got in the group, and she was having such a great experience with the group that she said, Casey, you really need to get on Facebook just to be a part of the group. And Casey agreed. And so they've been working on their being individually and collectively as a couple. And they've had a major transformation in their marriage. And I don't know all the other transformations that they've had, but it's something that they decided to both work on being collectively and individually. And it's been really powerful for them. And I'll share one other example with my son. My son, he's 22, and he was home for, I think it was Father's Day this year. We had a Father's Day event. And the end of his time being home on that trip, we had some communications that did not go very well. And he ended up leaving, and he was upset when he left. And then he and my wife, that's his stepmom, they had, I'll call it a cleanup conversation. They had a conversation to kind of get back on the same page, and that didn't go well. And so I was talking to my son about these two experiences, and I said, in both these experiences, you weren't being listening. So you had what you wanted to say, and then when it was time for your stepmom or me to share, you weren't interested in what we had to say. You were interested in what you had to say. And so I said, if you're being listening, what I mean by that, son, is that if you put on your listening hat, right? When we put on our listening hat, we're not thinking about what we want to say. We're just being with the person and listening. And then if you want to go advanced listening, feed back to that person what they said to you. So they got that you got them. And I said, I'll transform the communication. So I was teaching about being listening. And so just last night, I had a conversation with my son, and I was sharing with him some things. And at the end of the conversation, Meredith, he fed back to me what I was saying to him. And so he instantly implemented it in the real world. And there's so much disconnection around communication because people are so interested in what they want to say. And they're not being listening. And so this is deep work, and there's so many distinctions that Steve has shared with us. And that's why get into the content, especially watching those videos that Steve did. I mean, these are like $5,000 per YouTube video. These podcast episodes are regular people sharing about being that can transform your life. And if you if you really dig in and do the work on this, and you go through the content that has been created, I don't know of any other I'll call it a personal development movement out there outside of ours, where you don't have to make a big financial investment in order to be a part of it. In other words, if they're really involved in Landmark, which I've done several Landmark programs and I love Landmark, but every time you do Landmark, it's a fee. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's training companies charge fees. That's what they do. This is different though. We're not asking for an upfront fee. If you want to hire one of our coaches, that's fine. But we have transformational content, totally free. We do encourage you to buy the book, because that is the foundation of the whole movement, is that book, The Ultimate Coach by Amy Hardison. But there's so much here if you just dig in.
You know, Eric, listening to you, and I love the example you gave about listening, because it's so true. My two business partners and I have been in the business of communication skills for more than 30 years, and listening is always that foundational piece. And we never get to the end of it. You know, I still learn constantly about how I can up-level my listening. But the other thing I was thinking of is in just the last interview I did with Heather Quick, who's a very active member, she was talking about going to that very first event in Phoenix and putting on her $200,000 listening ears. And what she meant by that is that there were a lot of people in that room that had paid Steve $200,000 for their coaching with him. And she had not done that. And she thought, you know what? If I come into this with the idea that I have invested that amount of money, how would I show up? How would I show up with my listening? And so she instantly up-leveled her own listening for the whole event. And especially when Steve was speaking, the ideas that she got from him, one in particular, truly were life-changing, because she immediately implemented the key thing that he said that just really hit her. So I'm thinking, for everybody listening to this, if you go into some of these resources that Eric has just shared, these podcasts or watching the videos, if you imagine you've invested $200,000 in those resources, how would you approach them? How would you listen differently than if they were free? You would invest that time, energy, attention to get every morsel out of what's being shared. That's how I'm sensing and responding to what you were just saying about these rich resources that people can take advantage of.
Absolutely. And I have a couple of instructions for all of you that are listening. And one instruction is, I want you to listen to this podcast 7 times. And the reason I want you to do that is so you can get the key concepts that I was sharing into your subconscious mind. And you've all had this experience when you're in your car and you're listening to a song that you really love, and you start rocking out to the song, you start singing along with the song. How did the words to the song get in your head? And the answer is repetition. So if you consume content with repetition, like this podcast 7 times, it will put these best ideas into your subconscious mind. I also want to highly encourage you to share this podcast with the people that you care about in your life. And that can be your spouse, your children, your significant other. It could be your other family members, your parents. It can be your coworkers. If you have a team of people, being works in business, share with them. Because all you have to do is just say, hey, take a listen to this podcast. And that will introduce them to all of these ideas, all these great free resources. And you can create transformation for people by simply sharing this podcast. And then lastly, go to beingmovement.com and opt in so we can stay in touch with you via email. And look on there, scroll to the bottom at the different social medias, whichever social media you're interested in, connect. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're into YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast, listen to more podcasts. If you're a podcast person, join the Facebook group. If you're a Facebook person, do the TikTok, whichever ones that you're interested in, because this content, it's the best content I've ever found in personal development. Steve Hardison has of all the people I've ever studied, the best ideas. And go watch those YouTube videos, especially the ones of him, these hour-long clips. His clips are on TikTok as well. It is profound. Get the book, The Ultimate Coach. If you haven't got it yet, go buy it on Kindle, Amazon, or paperback, Kindle, or Audible. I have all three formats. We have a Spanish version as well. Come to the live events. There's so much available for you, and there is no financial investment required. And so, Meredith, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, Eric, thank you. That was a great summary of calls to action for people to take. So I want to close by acknowledging you and thanking you for the investment you made in your time, the commitment you have made. 20 years is extraordinary to make a commitment. There are 3 years behind you now. So it's exciting to reflect on the vision that you described earlier of wanting to really reach all of humanity. What a difference that would make if we could raise the consciousness of folks and raise their awareness about what being really means and how they can implement that in their lives. So thank you for all that you have done. Your leadership is extraordinary in what you have helped co-create with all of these different entities that exist, because not only are people feeling called, but you are welcoming and responding in such a way that more people step forward to get involved. So thank you, Eric, for who you are being in the world and who you are being in this Ultimate Coach group and the Being movement. I appreciate you, and so many others do too.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you for joining us today. If there's someone you know who could benefit from this conversation, please share this episode with them. Also, check out our website, beingmovement.com. You'll find valuable resources and links to connect to an engaging and wonderfully supportive community. Together, we can inspire and support each other on the path to a greater understanding of being. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself.